A desperate, pregnant maid gives her last few coins to a grieving stranger, unaware he is the millionaire father of her unborn child. "You are dismissed," the voice echoed, cold and final. The rain hammered down on the glass of the employment agency's window, a relentless percussion that mirrored the frantic thudding in Alara's own chest. Each drop that splattered and slid down the pane felt like a tear for the future she had just lost, a future that had already been so fragile, so perilously balanced on the edge of a knife. The sterile silence inside the small, impersonal office was somehow louder than the storm outside, a heavy blanket of judgment that pressed down on her, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She stood there, a threadbare coat pulled tightly around her burgeoning frame, the worn fabric a pathetic shield against the biting cold of the room and the even colder dismissal she had just received. The words, spoken by the impeccably dressed woman behind the polished mahogany desk, seemed to hang in the air, glittering with a cruel, sharp finality. They splintered the quiet hope Alara had been clinging to for weeks, a hope as thin and delicate as a spider's thread. She was dismissed. Her fingers, pale and trembling, instinctively went to the gentle swell of her belly, a silent, protective gesture that was both an anchor and a source of her unbearable fear. This life, this innocent, unspoken promise growing within her, was the reason for her current predicament, the cause of the disdain in the agency manager's eyes, and the single, sacred reason she had to keep fighting. The manager, Mrs. Gable, had not even tried to hide her disgust, her gaze flicking from Alara's face to her stomach with a barely concealed sneer, as if the very idea of a pregnant, unmarried woman seeking employment as a domestic servant was a personal affront to her sense of order and decency. Alara had tried to explain, her voice quiet and dignified, that her condition would not impede her ability to work, that she was strong, that she was desperate, but her pleas had fallen on deaf ears, absorbed by the thick carpet and the soundproofed walls of the pristine office. It was no use. Her world had just contracted to the size of this suffocating room, and now even that was being taken away. She was out. She nodded once, a small, jerky movement of her head, unable to form any words past the raw, painful lump that had formed in her throat. To speak would be to let a sob escape, and her pride, the last tattered remnant of her former life, would not allow it. She would not give Mrs. Gable the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned with a quiet resolve, her worn boots making no sound on the plush flooring as she walked towards the door, feeling the weight of the manager's disapproving stare on her back with every step. The soft click of the door closing behind her was a sound of profound and devastating severance, cutting her off from the last possibility of a steady income, of a safe place to bring her child into the world. The hallway was dim and smelled of lemon polish and indifference. The world outside the agency's gleaming facade was a churning vortex of gray skies and pounding rain, a perfect reflection of the chaos that now raged inside her shattered heart. She had nothing. The biting cold of the November wind hit her the moment she stepped outside, soaking through her thin coat in an instant and chilling her to the bone. The city was a blur of hazy streetlights and sleek, dark cars that hissed by, spraying plumes of dirty water onto the pavement. Each passing vehicle was a reminder of a world she was no longer a part of, a world of warmth and purpose and destination. Alara pulled her collar up higher, a futile gesture against the relentless assault of the weather, and began to walk, her steps unsteady but determined. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to put distance between herself and the crushing humiliation she had just endured. Her savings, already meager, had dwindled to almost nothing. A few crumpled bills and a handful of coins tucked into a small pocket in her worn purse. It was barely enough for a few more nights at the grim, lonely boarding house she had been calling home, a place with peeling wallpaper and the constant scent of damp and despair. Soon even that would be gone. She was so terribly alone. She found herself drawn to the relative shelter of a small city park, its skeletal trees weeping rain onto the deserted pathways. The usual lunchtime crowd of office workers and tourists had been driven away by the storm, leaving the park empty and desolate, a landscape of sorrow that felt like an extension of her own soul. Alara sank onto a cold, wet bench beneath the partial canopy of a large oak tree, the rough wood seeping its dampness through her clothes. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from a deep, primal fear that was coiling in her gut. How was she going to survive? How could she protect the tiny, blameless life that depended entirely on her? Her mind raced, sifting through the wreckage of her options, finding only dead ends and impossible choices. The father of her child was a ghost, a memory of a single, tender night with a man whose name she never even learned, a stranger whose kind eyes had offered a fleeting moment of connection in her lonely world. It had been a mistake, a reckless moment of seeking warmth, but the result was now the most sacred and terrifying reality of her life. He was gone. It was then, as she sat there swallowed by her own misery, that she saw him. He was on a bench across the way, partially obscured by the heavy fog and the sheets of rain, a solitary figure hunched against the storm. He seemed even more defeated by the weather than she was, wearing only a thin jacket that was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He wasn't moving, just staring at the ground with a haunted, hollow expression that seemed to absorb all the grayness of the day. There was a profound stillness about him, a quality of such absolute desolation that it pierced through Alara's own wall of suffering. She watched him for a long time, a strange, unspoken kinship forming between them across the rain-swept distance. He looked like a man who had lost everything, a man who had forgotten how to even feel the cold. He looked broken. A raw, undeniable pang of empathy resonated deep within her. She knew that look. She knew the weight of that stillness, the feeling of being so completely unmoored from the world that you become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. In her purse, nestled in a small, insulated container, was her dinner for the night, a modest portion of leftover stew she had been carefully rationing. It was all the food she had. Her stomach clenched with a sharp pang of hunger just thinking about it, a visceral reminder of her own desperate situation. But as she looked at the stranger, at his gaunt profile and the deep, weary lines etched around his eyes, her own needs seemed to fade into the background. He looked more in need of warmth, of a simple human kindness, than she was. A quiet battle waged within her. To give away her only meal was foolish, reckless, an act of self-sabotage when she was already on the brink. Her baby needed her to be strong, to be practical. But her heart, a stubborn and gentle thing, argued back. It whispered of her own mother, who had always taught her that kindness was a currency that never ran out, that the purest act of giving was to offer what little you had to someone who had even less. The man across the park didn't know it, but he was offering Alara a choice: to succumb to the bitterness of her circumstances or to rise above them, if only for a single, selfless moment. She hesitated for only a second longer, her hand hovering over the clasp of her purse. Then, with a soft sigh that was part resignation and part resolve, she made her decision. Her own suffering felt unbearable, but the thought of leaving him there, so completely alone in his own private storm, was somehow worse. She would not let the world make her hard. She stood up, her legs stiff from the cold, and walked across the wet grass, the container of stew clutched in her hands like a precious offering. He didn't look up as she approached, his gaze still fixed on some unseen point on the drenched pavement. She stopped in front of him, the rain dripping from her hair onto her face. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to cut through his stupor. He lifted his head slowly, and for the first time she saw his eyes. They were a deep, startling blue, but they were clouded with a grief so profound, so raw, that it made her own heart ache in recognition. He looked at her with a weary confusion, as if she were an apparition. She held out the container. "You look like you could use this more than me," she said simply. Her words were sincere, free of pity or expectation. It was a statement of fact, an observation from one weary soul to another. He stared at the small offering, then back at her face, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, stunned disbelief. A flicker of something, a light long since extinguished, seemed to spark in the depths of his haunted eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to refuse, but no words came out. He just shook his head slightly, a silent protest. "Please," she insisted, her voice gentle but firm. "I want you to have it." She placed the container on the bench beside him, a small beacon of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness of the park. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, a spark of human contact that felt seismic in its intensity. He froze. For a long, unspoken moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound by a shared, invisible sorrow. He saw in her a quiet dignity, a pure, unwavering strength that defied her fragile appearance. She saw in him a man drowning in an ocean of pain, a man who had forgotten that goodness still existed in the world. She gave him a small, sad smile, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words ever could. Then, without waiting for a thank you, she turned and walked away, melting back into the gray mist from which she had emerged. She did not look back. Alistair Vance, the billionaire CEO of Vance Industries, a man who could buy anything he desired, sat motionless on the park bench, staring at the container of stew. He hadn't known it yet, but this moment, this simple, selfless act of kindness from a complete stranger, would change everything. The warmth from the container seeped into his cold hands. He was saved. The night that followed was the longest of Alara's life. After leaving the park, the momentary warmth of her good deed quickly evaporated, replaced by the gnawing, biting reality of her situation. The last of her coins went to a cup of hot tea from a small cafe, a meager purchase that allowed her to sit at a small table in the back for an hour, soaking up the warmth before the owner politely asked her to leave. The hunger in her stomach was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, twisting pain. Each pang was a fresh wave of panic, a terrifying reminder of the child who depended on her for sustenance. She spent the rest of the night in a brightly lit, all-night bus shelter, huddled in a corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort, and the sterile silence of the empty shelter was broken only by the hiss of passing cars and the relentless pounding of the rain against the plexiglass. Sleep was impossible. Her mind was a carousel of fears, spinning endlessly through scenarios of homelessness and despair. She clutched her worn silver locket, the cool metal a small, familiar comfort against her skin, and prayed for a miracle she no longer believed in. She had given away her last meal, an act that now seemed both profoundly right and catastrophically foolish. She was alone. Meanwhile, in a stately, cavernous penthouse overlooking the glittering, rain-slicked city, Alistair Vance was a man reborn. The encounter in the park had shattered the thick, impenetrable wall of grief he had built around himself since the death of his wife, Amelia, 2 years prior. For 24 months, he had been a ghost in his own life, a recluse managing his vast empire through video calls and terse emails, his heart a hollow, frozen chamber. The world had become a transactional, cynical place, devoid of the sincere, gentle light that Amelia had brought into it. But the woman in the park, her quiet, dignified presence, her selfless act, had been a shock to his system, a jolt of pure, unadulterated goodness that he had forgotten was possible. He ate the stew, each spoonful a revelation. It was simple, humble food, but it tasted of compassion, of a shared humanity that felt more nourishing than any gourmet meal he had ever eaten. The warmth spread from his stomach through his entire body, chasing away a cold that had been lodged in his soul for 2 long years. He felt a profound, undeniable shift inside him. He had to find her. The thought became an obsession, a new purpose that burned through the heavy fog of his grief. He had let her walk away without even asking for her name, a mistake that now seemed unforgivable. He had nothing to go on but the memory of her weary, unwavering eyes and the faded, threadbare coat she wore. But Alistair Vance was not a man without resources. He called his head of security, a sharp, efficient man named Marcus, in the middle of the night. The instructions were clear and commanding. Find the woman from the park. He described her in meticulous detail, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't shown in years. It was a near impossible task, a search for a single anonymous face in a city of millions. But for the first time in a long time, Alistair felt a flicker of hope. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the storm finally begin to break, a golden glow appearing on the eastern horizon. He would find her. He had to. Days turned into a week, and for Alara, each day was a slow descent into deeper desperation. Her time at the boarding house ran out, and the stern-faced landlady had shown her the door with a distinct lack of sympathy. She spent her days in public libraries, seeking warmth and a place to rest, and her nights in shelters, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and unspoken sorrow. The pregnancy was becoming more obvious, her body changing in ways that were both miraculous and terrifying. She felt the first gentle flutters of life inside her, a secret, tender communication that filled her with a fierce, protective love. Even as her circumstances grew more dire, she applied for every menial job she could find, dishwashing, cleaning, anything, but her visible condition was an immediate disqualification. The world seemed to have no place for a woman like her. Her hope had become a brittle, fragile thing, on the verge of shattering completely. She was fading. Then, one bleak afternoon, as she was preparing to leave the library for another uncertain night, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. It was a call from a high-end domestic placement agency, one she would never have dreamed of approaching. The woman on the phone had a crisp, professional voice and an unbelievable offer. A private client, a reclusive gentleman who owned a large estate just outside the city, was in immediate need of a live-in housekeeper. The salary was more than she had ever earned. The accommodations were private and fully furnished, and the duties were light. The client, the woman explained, valued privacy and a quiet atmosphere above all else. He did not wish to be disturbed. It felt too good to be true, a dream conjured from the depths of her desperation. When she hesitantly mentioned her pregnancy, expecting the familiar click of a hung-up phone, the woman simply paused and said, "The client is aware of your situation and has specified that it is not an issue." A sob caught in Alara's throat. Disbelief warred with a seismic surge of relief. It was the miracle she had prayed for. She accepted. The estate was more magnificent than anything Alara could have imagined. A long, winding driveway curved through acres of manicured gardens, leading to a stately, ornate mansion of gray stone and dark slate. It was beautiful but imposing, exuding an air of wealth and a deep, profound loneliness. She was greeted at the door by Mrs. Peterson, the head of staff, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes and a soft voice who showed Alara to her own small, impeccably clean apartment in a separate wing of the house. The mansion was cavernous and hushed, the air still and cool. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, its polished marble floors and ornate furniture untouched, preserved under a veil of sterile silence. Alara learned that the owner, a Mr. Vance, was a widower who kept to himself, rarely leaving his private library and study. Her duties were simple: to maintain the quiet order of the house, to be a ghost in its grand, empty halls. For the first time in months, Alara felt a sense of security, a fragile but undeniable feeling of safety. The relentless hammering of fear in her chest began to soften into a steady, quiet rhythm. She was safe. For 2 weeks, Alara worked in the silent, sprawling house, never once laying eyes on its mysterious owner. She cleaned rooms that were never used, dusted furniture that was never sat upon, and found a strange, quiet peace in the rhythmic, solitary nature of her work. She spoke often to her unborn child, her soft whispers the only sound in the vast, echoing spaces. The house, for all its cold grandeur, had become her sanctuary. One evening, she was tasked with tidying the library, a magnificent 2-story room lined with thousands of books, a grand fireplace at its center. A fire was crackling softly in the hearth, casting a warm, amber hue over the room. And there, in a large leather armchair with his back to the door, sat Mr. Vance. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had not expected to find him here. She started to back away slowly, not wanting to disturb him, but a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. He turned his head. His eyes met hers across the room, and the world seemed to stop. It was him, the man from the park. He was different, yet undeniably the same. The gaunt, haunted look was gone, replaced by a commanding, composed presence. He was dressed in an impeccable dark suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and the deep, raw grief in his eyes had been banked, hidden behind a polished, controlled facade. But she knew those eyes, and he, in turn, recognized her instantly. He saw the same gentle, unwavering spirit, the same quiet dignity that had pierced through his haze of sorrow in the park. 1,000 unspoken questions hung in the air between them. He stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. "You," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that echoed in the vast, silent room. Alara's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible coincidence. The kind stranger, the reclusive millionaire. They were the same person. She felt a flush of embarrassment, then a jolt of fear. Did he hire her out of pity? Was this some kind of strange, elaborate charity? Her hand went to her stomach, the old protective instinct kicking in. He saw the gesture, and his expression softened. "It's all right," he said, taking a step towards her. "I'm glad you're here." He did not mention the park. He did not explain. He simply looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. Total silence. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them in the days that followed. Alistair did not reveal that he had orchestrated her employment, and Alara did not mention their encounter in the park. It was a shared secret that hummed in the quiet spaces between them, creating a strange and undeniable intimacy. They began to fall into a gentle routine. He would often be in the library when she came to tidy in the evenings, and what began as polite, hesitant greetings slowly blossomed into quiet conversations. He would ask about her day, his voice soft, his questions sincere. She, in turn, would find herself speaking to him with an openness she hadn't felt with anyone before. She told him about her love of old books, about the simple lullabies her mother used to sing to her, melodies she now hummed to the child in her womb. He was a steady, unwavering listener, his gaze never leaving her face, making her feel as though her small, simple stories were the most important words in the world. He was healing her with his quiet attention, though she did not know it. One rainy evening, much like the day they first met, she found him in the library, staring into the flickering light of the fire, a small, silver-framed photograph in his hand. The polished mask he usually wore had slipped, and the profound, raw grief she had seen on the park bench was back in his eyes, stark and unveiled. He didn't seem to notice her enter the room. She stood in the doorway, hesitant to intrude on such a private, sacred moment of sorrow. She started to retreat, but he spoke without turning around, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Her name was Amelia," he said, his words a heavy weight in the soft hush of the room. "She was my wife." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes glistening in the firelight. He beckoned her closer, a silent invitation to share his grief. This was the beginning of the confession. Alara moved quietly to his side, her heart aching for this powerful man who suddenly seemed so fragile. He told her about Amelia, about their whirlwind romance, about the laughter that used to fill the now silent halls of the mansion, about the car accident that had stolen her from him 2 years ago, shattering his world and leaving him in a state of perpetual twilight. He spoke of the unbearable guilt he carried, the feeling that he should have been able to protect her, the way her absence was a physical presence, a constant hollow ache in his chest. He wasn't speaking to his maid. He was speaking to a fellow soul who understood the language of loss. Alara listened with her entire being, her expression one of pure, sincere empathy. She did not offer empty platitudes or hollow reassurances. Instead, when he finally fell silent, his story hanging in the air between them like smoke, she quietly went to the small kitchenette adjoining the library and made him a cup of tea, just the way he liked it. She placed the warm mug in his trembling hands, a simple, grounding gesture of care. He took a sip, the warmth seeming to steady him. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a raw gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he looked at her, at the gentle curve of her stomach, and a new understanding dawned in his eyes. "And you?" he asked softly. You carry your own sadness, don't you? It was her turn. Hesitantly at first, then with a quiet rush of cathartic release, she shared her own story. She spoke of her loneliness, her fears for the future, her desperation. She told him about the baby's father, describing him not as an irresponsible cad but as a fleeting, beautiful memory. A man she had met for a single night, a kind stranger whose face was now a blur but whose gentle touch she remembered vividly. She spoke of the shame and the profound, overwhelming love she felt for her unborn child, a love that was her only anchor in a turbulent sea. As she spoke, Alistair listened, his body rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped his teacup. Every word she said was a piece of a puzzle falling into place, a puzzle he had not even known he was solving. The lullaby she hummed, the way she described that one tender night, it was all coming back to him in a dizzying seismic rush. It was his. He realized with a certainty that thudded in his chest like a drumbeat that he was the father of her child. The night she described was a night he had barely allowed himself to remember, a night during the depths of his grief when he had wandered out of his desolate home, seeking any kind of human connection to prove he was still alive. He had met a woman with kind, sad eyes, and for a few brief hours, they had found a gentle, anonymous solace in each other's arms. He had left before dawn, ashamed of his weakness, and had pushed the memory away. And now here she was, the woman from that night, the woman from the park, the woman who had unknowingly saved him twice over, was living in his house carrying his son. The revelation was so profound, so overwhelming, that he could not speak. He wanted to tell her everything, to bridge the impossible chasm between them, but the moment was too fragile, too sacred. He knew he had to wait. He had to earn her trust first, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a man. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of shared understanding, of a bond forged in the crucible of shared grief. She leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken connection between them. A new hope began to dawn. The quiet, fragile world they had built was shattered by the unexpected arrival of Beatrice Vance. Alistair's mother was a formidable woman, sharp-edged and clad in crisp designer suits, her presence sucking the warmth out of every room she entered. She descended upon the mansion like a hawk, her critical eyes missing nothing, her judgments swift and merciless. Her relationship with Alistair had been strained for years, and his reclusive behavior since Amelia's death had only widened the chasm between them. She saw his grief not as a wound to be healed, but as a weakness to be eradicated. When her gaze landed on Alara, her eyes narrowed with an immediate, icy disdain. She saw a pregnant maid, and in her elitist, transactional world, that equated to one thing: a gold-digging opportunist who had somehow ensnared her vulnerable, grieving son. She made her contempt clear through a series of thinly veiled insults and condescending commands, treating Alara not as a person but as a piece of furniture to be moved and polished at will. Alara bore the woman's cruelty with her usual quiet dignity, but Beatrice's venom was a constant, corrosive presence, turning her sanctuary into a place of anxiety. Beatrice, in her typical fashion, decided that the best cure for her son's morbid seclusion was to force him back into society. She announced she would be hosting her annual charity luncheon for the Children's Literacy Fund at the mansion, an event that would bring dozens of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures into their quiet lives. Alistair protested, but his mother was a relentless force of nature, and he eventually relented, worn down by her insistence. He warned Alara, his eyes filled with apology, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The day of the luncheon arrived, a bright, cold afternoon. The mansion was transformed, its sterile silence replaced by the buzz of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Sleek, gleaming cars lined the driveway, and women in ornate jewels and men in tailored suits drifted through the cavernous rooms. Alara was tasked with helping the catering staff, her movements quiet and unobtrusive as she moved through the crowd, feeling utterly invisible and out of place. She tried to avoid Beatrice, but she could feel the older woman's cold eyes following her every move. The public humiliation was about to begin. The climax came during the main speech, Beatrice stood before the assembled guests, a picture of polished philanthropy, speaking eloquently about the importance of giving back. Then her tone shifted. She paused dramatically, her gaze sweeping the room before landing, with surgical precision, on Alara, who was quietly clearing plates at the far end of the room. "But charity, my friends, begins at home," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with poison. "It means protecting one's family from those who would take advantage of kindness, from those with no morals, no shame." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Beatrice then held up a delicate, diamond-encrusted bracelet. "This valuable piece of jewelry, a family heirloom, went missing from my room this morning, and it was just discovered in the pocket of this young woman's apron." A collective gasp echoed through the hall. All eyes turned to Alara. She froze, the plate in her hand trembling. She looked at Beatrice, whose face was a mask of triumphant cruelty. It was a lie, a vicious, calculated setup designed to destroy her. She was overwhelmed. I didn't," Alara stammered, her voice a fragile whisper. "I would never," but her words were lost in the rising tide of accusation. Beatrice advanced on her, her voice sharp and commanding. "And what about your condition?" she hissed, gesturing disdainfully at Alara's stomach. "Shamelessly parading your mistakes in a respectable home. You are a disgrace. I want you out of this house." Now the humiliation was unbearable, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she held them back, her pride a lone soldier fighting a losing battle. The guests stared, some with pity, most with morbid curiosity. She was alone, exposed, and utterly defenseless. Just as two security guards began to move towards her, a voice cut through the tense, heavy atmosphere, calm but powerful. "That is enough." Alistair appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the entire room. He descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed not on his mother, but on Alara, his expression a mixture of fury and a deep, tender protectiveness. He walked through the parted crowd and stopped directly in front of her, placing himself between her and his mother, a human shield. He turned to face Beatrice, his gaze now as cold and hard as polished steel. "I know for a fact that you were wearing that bracelet less than an hour ago, Mother," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I also know that you have been looking for a way to get rid of Alara since the moment you arrived. You will apologize to her." Now the powerful monologue had begun. He then addressed the stunned guests. "This woman, Alara, has more integrity, more honor, and more pure, selfless kindness in her heart than anyone I have ever known. She is the furthest thing from a thief. She is, in fact, the person who saved me from the darkness I have been living in for the past 2 years." He looked back at Alara, his eyes softening with an emotion so profound, so undeniable, it silenced the entire room. The grand revelation was coming. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch both a comfort and a promise. "And you will all show her the respect she is due," he declared, his voice ringing with unwavering conviction. "She is not a disgrace. She is the mother of my child." He had done the unthinkable. The room erupted. The aftermath was a blur of shocked whispers, hasty departures, and the cold, silent fury of Beatrice Vance, who was swiftly and unceremoniously escorted from the premises. Soon, the cavernous hall was empty, save for the two of them. Alara stood in the center of the room, still reeling from the seismic shock of his public declaration, his words echoing in her ears. "Mother of my child." It didn't seem possible. She looked at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He had defended her, saved her, and in doing so had claimed her and her baby in front of the entire world. Alistair closed the distance between them, his eyes searching hers, pleading for her to understand. The resolution had to be complete. "It was me, Alara," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I was the man on the park bench. And I was the man from that night." He finally confessed everything. He told her about the suffocating grief that had driven him out into the city months ago, a ghost seeking a flicker of life. He described their brief, tender encounter not as a mistake, but as a moment of profound, shared humanity that had pierced through his pain, a memory he had tried to bury out of shame and sorrow. He explained how he had searched for her after their meeting in the park, how he had arranged for her to work at the mansion so he could keep her safe, to repay the kindness she had shown him when he was a broken stranger. He confessed that he had been falling in love with her quiet strength and gentle spirit long before he pieced together the final, miraculous truth. "I didn't recognize you at first," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But then I started to see it, in your eyes, in the lullaby you hum, in the way you spoke of that night. It was you. It was always you." Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of humiliation or fear. They were tears of cathartic release, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever being rekindled into a brilliant flame. The fragmented memories of that night coalesced into a single, clear image. His kind, sad eyes, the same eyes that were looking at her now with such adoration. The ghost of a father for her child suddenly had a face, a name, a heart. He was not a stranger, but the man who had seen her, truly seen her, at her lowest and at her most virtuous. "I love you, Alara," Alistair whispered, framing her face with his hands, his touch gentle and reverent. "I love you for the kindness you showed a stranger. I love you for the dignity you never lost. And I love our child more than words can say. Please, let me be a father to our baby. Let me be a husband to you. Let us be a family in that moment. All the hardship, all the suffering, all the desperate, lonely nights vanished, replaced by the undeniable promise of a future filled with love and security." She looked at this man, her savior, her friend, the father of her child, and with a heart overflowing with emotion, she finally whispered the one word that would change their lives forever. Yes. 1 year later, the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight streamed through the large nursery window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the amber hue. The sterile silence of the mansion was a distant memory, replaced now by the soft gurgle and happy coos of a baby boy. Alistair stood by the crib. His commanding corporate presence melted away, replaced by the tender, unguarded expression of a devoted father. He gently rocked the ornate wooden cradle, a soft smile playing on his lips as he watched his son, Leo, sleep peacefully, one tiny hand curled around his finger. The room was filled with warmth and love, with soft blankets and well-loved toys, a testament to the life that had been brought into the once hollow home. The air smelled of baby powder and happiness. This was no longer a house. It was a home. Alara stood in the doorway, watching them, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She wore a simple, soft dress, and the haunted, weary look in her eyes had been replaced by a serene, joyful light. She was no longer the desperate, fragile woman fighting for survival. She was a wife, a mother, a woman cherished and adored. She walked quietly into the room and wrapped her arms around Alistair from behind, resting her head against his strong back. He leaned into her touch, turning his head to kiss her gently. "Look at him," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "He's perfect." Alara smiled, her gaze fixed on their beautiful son. "He has your eyes," she murmured, tracing the line of Alistair's jaw with her finger. They stood there for a long time, two souls once lost in their own private storms, now anchored together by a love that had been born from a single, selfless act of kindness. The worn silver locket she still wore felt warm against her skin, no longer a symbol of a painful past, but a reminder of the incredible, winding journey that had led her to this perfect, sacred moment of peace. Their family was complete. This story, at its core, is a fable about the immense, transformative power of a single act of unsolicited kindness. It illustrates how one person's decision to offer compassion, even at great personal cost, can set in motion a chain of events that leads to miraculous salvation and profound emotional healing. Alara, in her moment of deepest despair, chose generosity over self-preservation, and in doing so, she unknowingly saved the man who would, in turn, save her. It is a testament to the idea that our true worth is not measured by our material possessions or our station in life, but by the purity of our hearts and the grace we extend to others, especially to those who seem to have nothing to offer in return. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your belief in the goodness of humanity, please take a moment to reflect on the opportunities for kindness in your own life. We often underestimate the impact of a small gesture. A warm meal, a listening ear, a moment of sincere empathy. These are the threads that weave the fabric of a better, more compassionate world. The love between Alistair and Alara was built on a foundation of seeing the inherent worth in another human being, a lesson that resonates far beyond the pages of a story. We invite you to join our community of viewers who cherish soul-stirring narratives of love, hope, and redemption. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales for more heartwarming stories that will uplift your spirit and remind you of the undeniable power of love. We'll see you in the next one.